one of the like misconceptions that many people have, even just like starting in the space, is like thinking that by default crypto is private, which is not, or it's anonymous, and it's not, right? It's pseudonymous. So basically, whenever you do an action on blockchains like Ethereum or Bitcoin or most of the other public blockchains, those actions get recorded forever. And that could be like legal risks, there could be personal risk, there could be like financial risk as well, just leaking all your information and storing that in a blockchain where you cannot delete it, you cannot edit it.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unchained, your no-hype resource for all things crypto. I'm your host, Laura Shin. Thanks for joining this live stream, which is pre-recorded, I should let you know. Before we get started, a quick reminder, nothing you hear on Unchained is investment advice. This show is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and my guests and I may hold assets discussed on the show. For more disclosures, visit unchainedcrypto.com.
Are you a builder who needs to add on-chain trading to your product? The Uniswap Trading API from Uniswap Labs offers plug-and-play access to some of the deepest liquidity in crypto. It's on-chain execution at an enterprise level. More liquidity, less complexity. Visit hub.uniswap.org to learn more.
Today's topic is Ethereum privacy, and here to discuss are Andy Guzman, PSE lead at the Ethereum Foundation, and Oskar Thorén, technical lead of the Institutional Privacy Task Force at the Ethereum Foundation. Welcome, Andy and Oskar.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So in early October, the Ethereum Foundation announced that it was establishing what it was calling the Privacy Cluster, a team of 47 researchers, engineers, and cryptographers coordinated by BlockScout and XDive founder Igor Baranov in order to establish privacy as a first-class property of Ethereum. Explain what the Privacy Cluster is and what its mission is. And Andy, why don't you start?
Right. So I would say the Privacy Cluster is this very focused effort on trying to make Ethereum more private, on bring it more and make it a default. So actually, the Ethereum Foundation has a long history into just bringing more researchers, engineers into this area. PSC, or Privacy Stewards of Ethereum, is one of these teams who has been running from since 2019, exploring new use cases on privacy on identity at the application layer, privacy on reputation, privacy on many different aspects that I can go deeper later. But this is a renewed effort with more resources, with more people, into just expanding and pushing this space of privacy. So the privacy ecosystem on Ethereum is already very big, but it needed to have a bit more of like coordination, focus on different areas that perhaps before we weren't exploring.
And Oskar, why don't you explain what the mission is for the Privacy Cluster?
Yeah, so IPTF is a new team, so Institutional Privacy Task Force, and basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to get institutions to build on top of public blockchains like Ethereum specifically, with the focus on solving their privacy requirements. So that's basically the mission, and I think that also is very much in line with sort of the recent changes at the Ethereum Foundation, with the sort of new executive leadership coming in and an increased focus on sort of ecosystem developments and so on. So I guess more broadly at the EF, there is the protocol cluster, which is focused on L1, and then there's the EcoDev cluster, and then the privacy cluster. And IPTF, I guess, sits a little bit between sort of it's mostly in the privacy cluster, but also with sort of some connections to the EcoDev cluster and specifically the enterprise team that talk to some of the biggest institutions in the world. And I guess what we've seen is that like it used to be that regulation was the primary blocker, but nowadays, or especially this year in the last few years, privacy is actually the main blocker in terms of these institutions moving on chain. Yeah.
So privacy has become a huge trend in crypto, as I'm sure you guys are aware. And to me, it feels like this wave started with Zcash back in late September. And then the announcement from the EF about the privacy cluster came in early October. And I couldn't help but wonder if it was sparked by, what we were seeing in the market or if this initiative had been in the works. Just explain generally how it came about.
So I would say that the renewed focus just started beginning of this year, even with more. So it's been like a long brewing. And again, as I've said, like the team has been like expanding and growing. And I would say it's just like very nice timing and convenience that the market recognized the importance. So we were already seeing the need, the adoption, the force, I guess. So perhaps, it could have seemed like we kind of like reacted, but in reality, like this team and, the blog posts, the mission statements, the kind of like the investment and the roadmap and strategy has been, preparing all this year, more specifically in the last kind of like second half of the year. So it's just like nice coincidence.
Yeah, I would echo that and also say like So I've been in the privacy space and related to Ethereum for the last 7 years or so. So I think this has always been a very big focus, like privacy in terms of the Ethereum ecosystem. And obviously, projects like Zcash started early and have done a lot of pioneering work. But I think the Ethereum ecosystem is like also been very early and building a lot of these kind of core technical primitives that are then being used and creating these kind of new verticals, if you will, like if it's CKID or CKTLS or CKMs and all of these things. And I think historically, also going back to what Andy mentioned, is that PSC used to be kind of its own organization. So it's already been like a massive effort funded by the Ethereum Foundation. I think what is new this year is that it sort of focuses mission a little bit and focusing on privacy on Ethereum specifically and not sort of privacy broadly in sort of the ecosystem. So I think that is the main shift. So it was very much like a proactive thing, and whatever's been happening recently, that's more of a coincidence, I would say. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't think I knew that before. So Privacy Stewards of Ethereum started as a separate organization and then it kind of got folded into the EF.
Right. It has always been part of or supported by the Ethereum Foundation, but it operated a bit more externally. And I think that makes sense in that earlier years because like the primitives, like the creativity, or most of like kind of like just needs or explorations where it made sense. But right now it made a lot more sense to kind of like refocus 100% on the Ethereum space and not as broadly, and also to just better connect and collaborate with the rest of the Ethereum Foundation teams that existed.
Okay. And so explain what PSE is and a little bit about the history.
So PSE is a group of teams, a collection of teams that focus on bringing privacy. And its history spanned from, I guess, 2019, 2018, where it started with a small group of cryptographers and cryptographers, researchers and engineers exploring this new frontier that was zero-knowledge proofs. So it started with experiments on private identities, primitives and libraries and applications in which you can prove your identity that you were part of a group without revealing all the details of yourself. And these experimentations were looked by the Ethereum Foundation and basically started supporting this team into growing from 1, 2, 3, 30 up to, I think, almost like 50, 60 or 80 at some point. So it started as a team who were kind of like one of the first teams exploring rollups, one of the systems that Ethereum uses for scaling. The first team, or within the PSE, the first people who explored CK EVMs. So also one of the main kind of like scaling strategies that Ethereum uses. The team that supported TLS Notary, which is the pioneer in all that we call CKTLS. So all this space in which we can like make proofs about TLS connections. And it's just like, and a bunch of other examples like those that basically just expanded the use cases that we can bring to Ethereum. So before, PSE was broadly exploring all these use cases in both privacy and scalability. So that was what it used to stand for. And now it's 100% focused on privacy for Ethereum.
Okay.
And I would also say that it used to be that because so much of this was like cutting edge research, and at the time we didn't even know if it was possible to do have anything meaningful impact there. But I think what ended up happening is that there's been so much development in actually making these tools practical, and we see that now in the industry as a whole. And I think Ethereum Foundation has played a big part in making that even possible, and that also has led to this like renewed focus in terms of actually bringing this into production and more having a larger impact beyond sort of smaller R&D toys kind of thing. Yeah.
And then is the institutional policy? Why do I keep saying that? Institutional privacy
Yes.
Initiative, is that or whatever it's called? Institutional Privacy Task Force. Is that within PSE? Is that like a group
Yes,
within
it's
it?
within the privacy cluster, but it also has close collaborations with, for example, the enterprise team at in EcoDev. Yes.
Okay, and how did that get started?
Sorry?
How did that get started?
So that gets started, I guess, only 2 or 3 months or so. We have talked about it a bunch. I think what ended up happening is that as ETH sort of did the restructuring and there was more focus on being someone that institutions and enterprises would come to and have someone to talk to, it became very, very clear, and especially now with like Stablecoin Acts and things in the Genius Bill or MiCA, like all of these things are happening in the US and Europe and Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all this regulation, all this clarity that has led to sort of renewed interest from institutions. And it's sort of painfully clear that the main blocker for them is like the need for privacy. So it became very obvious that we needed to do something about this, because the enterprise team is great in terms of being able to have these initial conversations with these major institutions, but we have this very amazing R&D lab at PSC and all these amazing resources, and we basically try to connect the two dots. So whereas historically it's been purely focused on more sort of individual, like cypherpunk privacy, now we're also trying to recognize that like there's other actors that need privacy, and we can also be very useful to them.
Okay, so let's talk about why it is that privacy is important in crypto. And, this is the kind of thing where sometimes I feel like people in the US in particular, they may not understand it, but I would love to hear, why you think it's important for crypto to be focused on this.
Maybe we'll start just for individuals, right? So one of the misconceptions that many people have, even just like starting in the space, is like thinking that by default, crypto is private, which is not, or it's anonymous, and it's not, right? It's pseudonymous. So basically, whenever you do an action on blockchains like Ethereum or Bitcoin or most of the other public blockchains, those actions get recorded forever. And that could be like legal risks, there could be personal risk, there could be like financial risk as well, just leaking all your information and storing that in a blockchain where you cannot delete it, you cannot edit it, right? So that is just like a huge need for users. And I would say like all this cypherpunk movement, all this like start of this industry came from self-sovereign individuals and had like really strong ties to, privacy technology in itself. So as I've said, like it has always been the case that privacy has been important, but perhaps the tools just lack more maturity just in order to kind of like reach this inflection point of like, one, like we need it, and two, it's possible. It's getting, easy to use. It's cheaper to use, and just basically, it seems to be like the inflection point for individuals to use it. It's coming now, right? And we can see also the market, and we can see kind of like the attention. But at the end of the days, it has always been the case where privacy and having the freedom and the power to control who sees what from your information and your assets it goes back to kind of like the core values of these movement, I would say.
Yeah. And I would also say, like, yes, there's definitely this, like, it comes from this sort of cypherpunk origins and so on, and sort of privacy and the connection to freedom and self-sovereignty. I would say it's also, like, very practical in the sense that if you look at various hacks that happen, or for example, Ledger, when addresses got leaked, it had, like, very real-world consequences in terms of, like, people's addresses being leaked, and that was, like, led to actual physical attacks. So I think people are recognizing it's more and more important. I would also say that, like, when we think about something like cash, if I buy a coffee here, they can't see my entire sort of my income or my assets. All they know is like this bare asset like cash. And I think we have things like bank systems, and they have similar properties, but obviously they can be censored, and they have all these other problems associated with them. So what we have with public blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're great in terms of being digital and permissionless and so on, but as Andy mentioned, they are sort of transparent by default, which means you can actually sort of track things and so on. And what we're trying to do is kind of regain those properties that are more like cash-like properties. And I would also say, to your point, that it's maybe not as valued for a lot of people in developed countries like US, and I'm from Sweden. It's definitely seen as less of a problem. But I would say in lots of parts of the world, there are more adversarial circumstances where it matters a lot more. And I think as the world is moving more towards using blockchain technology, even you see attacks in like Paris and Miami, it's very much a real problem. I think people are waking up to that as more and more assets move on chain. And then there's also the institutional side, which is separate in terms of what they need privacy for. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, when you say Paris and Miami, are you talking about?
I'm talking about like various attacks that happened and
like wrench attacks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like.
And for you said Ethereum's been working on this for a few months, or really, you said all of 2025. Is that because like you're seeing demand from people, or is it just like, Ethereum is working from ideals and like what it would like to become, or is it that like people are actually requesting this type of feature?
Right. So I'll say definitely both. So again, there's a rich history of this, but it definitely seen a pickup about the right moment of how technology matures and how institutions demand it, and how just in general there's like a renewed sense of need, I guess, in the ecosystem of just re-emphasizing this property. So how I've been seeing is like the Ethereum ecosystem has focused a lot, and is focusing a lot on scaling. I'll focus a lot on usability, on maturing all the technical stack of the layers. And it just seems now that like a good breakaway case again will be like just turning privacy into like a day-to-day actions.
And I would say, yeah, definitely on the individual case and on the institutional side, we're definitely seeing a lot of demand. Like this is their blocker. Like they do want to move on chain and they want to move to Ethereum specifically, but they are not sure about how to get the privacy properties. So that is just like they need it. It's not a question of like, oh, maybe. It's like they need it.
Yeah, it's a table stakes requirement for institutions where if they don't, either they don't meet regulation or there's like big financial or business risk, right, of losing all their practices, their client,
Yeah, and do you have a background where you worked with banks in the past, or what were you doing before Ethereum?
So I worked in like fintech and so on. I come more from the protocols of research and the infrastructure side. So I've been working on sort of privacy solutions and peer-to-peer protocols and designing more secure systems and applied technology proofs. We have people in the team that sort of have an extensive background, worked at Goldman Sachs for many years and so on. And then we also have the enterprise team that is also have very close connections to these institutions. So we're definitely more on the sort of tech and research side of things, but we have excellent sort of support teams and great talent that allows us to sort of talk to these major institutions and understand their language. And I think that's very much a challenge. And what we're trying to bring to the table is like taking these like business requirements and translate them into something that the technical community can understand, as well as sort of the legal angle, which is also very important to understand what does this mean for existing regulation and future regulation, and how does that connect to technology. And that's something that I don't think anyone has really done, and we're basically trying to demystify that a little bit, yeah.
And what's your background?
So background in engineering, like led the engineering, management of teams in all sorts of development, like Web 2 and now more closely like Web 3, and, been working doing more product for various cryptography protocols and open source tooling that we have been building.
Okay. So, up until this point, Ethereum actually has some privacy, activity, I guess you could say, on Ethereum.
Right.
So, how do the current efforts differ from the past efforts? And I have to wonder if part of the reason now that it's being brought into the Ethereum Foundation is because some of, the legal stuff around what happened with Tornado Cash has been resolved. So I don't know if that also played a role. It's kind of two questions.
Right. Okay. So I would say again, Tornado Cash is like one of the, biggest protocols of privacy, and there was a lot of unclarity and a lot of risk and fears, and that definitely caused chilling effects on the ecosystem. But on the flip side, there was also good understandings and maturation and even conversation that sparked of what does privacy protocols that can also be compliant looks like in the future, right? So this is not only a conversation the Ethereum Foundation had, but rather the whole Ethereum ecosystem and crypto ecosystem in broad made a push and are continue to push it for more clarity. So that is on one side. On the other side is just there continues to be demand, right? So the more users, the more institutions, the more public, governments as well want to use these public blockchains. There's an increased, need of these tools. So definitely it played a role. But I will say in parallel, it's just just broader demand.
I would also say the technology has evolved a lot. So Tornado Cash was a very useful primitive, but we can do so much more now and more cheaper and so on. We have more expressive systems. So I think it sort of goes hand in hand as there's been so much accelerated R&D that the things we can do now are way, way more than just a few years ago. And that also impacts the kind of use cases that can be applied. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you describe, once what you're working on has come to its full fruition, like in your head, what's the ideal version of what this looks like? Walk me through, maybe a comparison between transactions today versus transactions in the future, or, certain applications or use cases that you think would be enabled once everything that you're working on comes to fruition. I'd love to hear kind of what the vision is.
Okay. So maybe I will start with saying right now we don't have metadata privacy. So metadata privacy is all the things that you leak, all information that you leak before you even do an action on the blockchain. So things whenever you open a wallet, you're leaking your IP addresses with the information that the wallet address, the on-chain address that you have, and there's a correlation to that. You're leaking what tokens you're pulling from, the price, the gas. You're leaking everything at the end of the day into all this myriad of infrastructure that exists just to provide users, most helpful. So current current state is like you're leaking everything. Future state is like, how can we give anonymity and confidentiality to all the requests that we do? And that is what we call within our cluster like private reads or metadata privacy. So every time you do a transaction or every time you try to read from the blockchain, you can do that privately. The other aspect will be like on-chain privacy or financial, which have very many different use cases, right? So in Ethereum, because it's such programmable, you can do all these financial use cases, which I can talk in a bit, but you can also do all these like governance use cases, right? So things like DAOs, things like voting, things like delegation and voting. Those are all things that have been maturing over the years, and that just basically by keep adding. Keeping like developing these infrastructures just makes sense to eventually have more corporations, have more local governments, local associations, just leverage these other use cases on chain, right? So it's maturing, and I would say like it will continue to solidify, increase kind of like the strength, the security of all these systems.
And then wait, so one question about the DAO voting, because right now we can all see when it's like a whale who's dominating the vote or, whatever.
Right.
But in this world, will that not be visible?
It could be possible that you design new use systems that are not only token dependent. So one of the drawbacks of basically one vote, one token is like basically whales dominate kind of like the narrative. They dominate the kind of like the outcomes of the votings in many of these DAOs. But there could be a system in which you just generate a zero knowledge proof of that you're an individual, that you have participated of a specific event, and that gives you access to just one vote. And then it will mean like it's very hard or it's impossible to game the system, and will actually be more like democratic processes. There are like many teams here building primitives called like zero knowledge CK passports or CK identities, where they're basically one-to-one mapped to an individual. So without disclosing the specific, your name, your specific, personal information, you can still prove that you can vote. So there are like many like new use cases that we can explore and that are currently being built in the Ethereum ecosystem that go beyond even financial, financial use cases. So I would expect like in the future there will be like more local governments or even like institutions and corporations using on-chain mechanisms for their deliberation decision processes.
And I would add, like also, for example, on the CKID side, spend lots of efforts at PSC to even make it possible, because a few years ago that was not something that was possible. Another thing is that you want to be able to do that on a client side, so for example, from your mobile phone, because what you're trying to prove is that you're in possession of a passport or something like that. If you upload your passport to a centralized server that then does that, you kind of lose the whole point. And that's used as like a building block in lots of systems when it comes to like KYC or voting and so on. So I think there's lots of these small building blocks. And the same thing goes for something like CKTLS that's used in certain on and off ramps. And the same thing for CKVM. So I think there's lots of examples of these technologies starting out as R&D products and then coming to fruition and now sort of having a very real impact. I would say in the institutional side, there's a very new team. It's only been on for 2 months or so. We have done a lot of mapping work, because what we are trying to do is basically, we talk to these major institutions, the biggest institutions in the world, usually a bit more on the financial side, but we also talk to some NGOs and governments. And we're trying to understand like what is the precise business needs and requirements. And then we try to document that and make as much of it public as possible. And then what we try is like connect that to what is going on in the ecosystem, because the ecosystem has developed all these technologies and primitives, and there are various vendors in the space. And we try to make that very explicit, like here's the business use case, here are the requirements, as well as the legal requirements, so like what jurisdiction are you operating under, because it's very different in the US versus Europe versus Japan. And then we try to connect it to what's going on in the Ethereum ecosystem with various types of specifications or standard ways of doing things, or mature vendors that are already providing similar solutions, and create these kind of feedback loops where if a vendor or a set of an approach is a perfect fit for an institution, then we can say this to the institution. And to the extent that some things are missing, we can also highlight that to the ecosystem and say, this is what institutions are asking for. And I would also say the reason that institutions come to us and why this IPTF team sits at the Ethereum Foundation is because we can be credibly neutral. We are basically responsible for the Ethereum ecosystem, and we're trying to onboard people onto Ethereum. And then we are neutral when it comes to sort of vendor choices and so on. So that's like where a lot of the focus for IPTF has been. And we had like a few workshops with major institutions where they are exploring maybe a stable coin or bonds or real world assets, something like that. and they have a specific set of questions. And it might be the case that they get approached by like a BD function from some other ecosystem, and they know some things, but they might be a bit confused. And we try to sort of clarify for them, like, here's what's happening, here's what's possible today, here are the trade-offs, here's how you should think about it. And that's kind of how we approach it, with the goal of eventually them moving on chain.
Okay, so now let's talk about the specific, approaches to technology, like to privacy, the different technologies that you are, considering, and like how you would apply them, which use cases you think certain technologies are more appropriate for, or even, demographics potentially. And I know there's probably trade-offs with each one. So I'd also love to hear like how you think about that aspect for each approach.
Right. So I would say like first is like mapping what are the use cases, right? So for example, I would say like most people when they think privacy in crypto, they think of private transactions, like sending money to another one, and private DeFi, at least within the Ethereum ecosystem. So within private transactions, there's like at least from like an initial mapping that we did, like at least 12 different families or approaches of technologies. So things like mixers and shielded pools are technologies that are already like zero knowledge based, and they have some properties that gives really strong anonymities depending on how much usage they have, right? There are things like proof of burn, which is more experimental, newer technologies that allows to kind of like, again, do a private transaction, but by leveraging other type of primitives that basically doesn't need funds to be mixed together. It's like, it hasn't been battle tested. There still needs to be some maturity for this technology, but it gives like a very nice exploration about some different paths that the ecosystem can take. There's this other one called stealth addresses, which basically generates a new address each time you receive funds. And that is more similar to the UTXO model that maybe other chains like are more familiar. And what this allows you is to unlink the different addresses that you have. So it's a bit of privacy for the receiver. So if you combine all these technologies, and there's other ones, right? Like FHE-based or homomorphic encryption-based that allows you to send funds and you know the sender and the receiver, but you don't know the asset and the amount, that gives you confidentiality. There are others which are based on hardware considerations like TEE or Trusted Execution Environment. So that allows, again, to just be very programmatic about what you can share and what you want to encrypt and de-encrypt and all the authentication layers and authorization layers. There is multi-party computation or MPC, which is like a way to operate into reduced set of parties. So if your use case requires less amount of participants, maybe MPC is a good fit. And there is fully homomorphic encryption, which is how do you operate privately or in encrypted data over a server. So all of these have kind of like are strong cryptographic primitives, or I would say like families of technologies that are very powerful some use cases. If I were just to say kind of like the key differences or how you could kind of like try to categorize them is like you will be doing trade-offs across cost, like how much you pay to use them, across speed, like how much time you need to do a transaction to keep certain levels of privacy. The other one is user experience, so one are more complicated than others. There are things about trust assumptions, like how many people need to collude to take out your privacy and privacy guarantees. And again, like institutions and perhaps like other type of users might prefer technologies that they can kind of like rely more on hardware, that are more permissioned, that are more compliant, versus other type of users, perhaps for daily payments, they just want something that is cheap and that is easy to use. And they don't care to be like extreme privacy. And there are others which is like, I don't know, high net worth transactions where they want like maximum privacy, but they run like on mobile phones, right? So that is where like at least these different families of technologies complement to each other. And I would expect as we mature that we can better categorize and surface those trade-offs. And at the end of the day, probably combine some of these to have like end-to-end privacy, which is fit for the right type of user.
Yeah, without that, like it's very much because it's applied cryptography, so there's a lot of various techniques and you can combine them in all kinds of ways and it can get kind of gnarly when you get into the details. Like if you have a rollup, for example, that the proving system you would use is very different from if you're trying to do some CKID solution that has to run on your phone. So it's very different depending on the deployment and also the specific like threat model and so on. And yeah, there's also things when it comes to more metadata privacy, if it's onion routing and mixed nets, there's a lot of different technologies. And I think, as Andy mentioned, they differ in terms of security and trust assumptions and performance, as well as like just technical maturity as well. So depending on, there's a lot of very promising research that are happening now that might only be actually widely deployed in a few years from now. And that's just the natural cycle of things. Just like Synopsis proofs used to be this thing that was more of a research problem like 10 years ago. And now we're seeing it more and more widely deployed. And you have similar things going on with FHC where it might take a little bit longer to sort of reach its full maturity.
Okay, yeah. I mean, just listening to it all, I'm just aware that it's, in a way, it's like you're going to create so much optionality, and then there will be multiple combinations that people can use to, achieve their goal.
Hey, founders and developers. If you're looking to bring on-chain trading to your product, wallet, or platform, check out the new Uniswap Trading API from Uniswap Labs. It's your plug-and-play gateway to global on-chain liquidity. No deep crypto experience required, and no need to manage complex integrations or ongoing maintenance. With the Uniswap Trading API, you'll get enterprise-grade on-chain execution, combining both on-chain and off-chain sources for the most competitive prices. Simply put, more liquidity, less complexity. And this isn't just any API. It connects directly to the Uniswap protocol, which has securely processed over $3.3 trillion in total volume with 0 hacks. So stop worrying about liquidity infrastructure and focus on building your product. Get access to the same liquidity that powers billions in swaps through one powerful API. Visit hub.uniswap.org to learn more.
I actually wanted to work through some of the different ways, at least these were the ones that were outlined in the blog post, to get more detail. So the first one was private reads and writes. Explain what that is and how it's being resolved or like the different ways that you're approaching that.
Mm-hmm. So private reads, I would say, is all these privacy that you want to ensure whenever you query the blockchain. So whenever you read the blockchain, so if this was a book, you don't want people to know which pages you are reading in particular or which sentences, because you might leak information about who you are and what you are interested or what are your intentions. So again, we can also mention this as metadata privacy. Private rights will be whenever you take an action, like writing, or whenever you do any action on the chain, right? So things like voting, things like delegating, things like purchasing NFTs, tokens, things like doing transactions, things like DeFi. All of these will have your actions recorded forever. So you would want these actions to have some level of privacy, so they cannot be linked back to your address or your intentions, or even like your persona. So I will call this like more on-chain privacy. And the third one, or track that we have, at least within PSE, we call private proving, which is like all these elements and libraries, which allows you to kind of like port data from Web 2 into the Web 3 world. So for example, if you have a driving license, if you have a bank account and you want to prove that you have more than a certain amount of funds in your bank account, you can already prove this with technologies that we're developing, and the Ethereum ecosystem as a whole is developing to port over these things, and a bunch of other kind of like necessary technical explorations, benchmarkings, and efforts that we're trying to do to make these things usable for the day-to-day users. So not only these things will run in like big servers and big computers, but rather they need to run in your phone, in your browser, in your laptop, in normal day-to-day hardware, I would say.
And I will say it is also very much in line with what you see with blockchains, that is about like removing trusted third parties, and you can think of it almost like as a way to sort of scale society, that as you have fewer dependencies, fewer things you have to do I trust this party, or do I have a legal contract or something like that? It's more that you're trusting the math as opposed to humans and policies. And as you do that, and especially as you do business across multiple jurisdictions, it sort of simplifies things, because as long as someone has proven that this works correctly and you trust that the code is secure, you can actually rely on it as a building block. And that's a major thing with, for example, private proving, that you can have this data provenance, and you, instead of trusting some custodian like some corporation to sort of deal with your KYC data or whatever, that easily gets hacked. We see that like every few months, that passport data gets leaked or gets hacked or all these things, right? So we're trying to remove that and basically have these building blocks where we can create proofs and use that sort of to build better systems, essentially. And that's kind of similar to how internet works as well. Like where you started, everything was in clear text and HTTP, and there was like a fight, all the crypto wars in the 90s. And then eventually everyone realized, oh, that's actually a great idea. We want HTTPS because that's how you do payments online. Otherwise, you can't buy something from Amazon. And just like natural, now people take it for granted. If you don't see sort of the green marker for HTTPS, that is like now every browser enforces it, right? So it's just taken for granted. And I think we see a similar things here with public blockchains and just creating things being more secure and something that you don't have to think about. It just kind of works under the hood.
And out of curiosity, is that something that financial institutions are like interested in because then all of a sudden they don't have this honeypot of data? Or is it something that they're a little bit wary of because then it gives them less control? It's
a good question. I think it depends on the institution. I think ultimately a lot of them, they have a very mature business and they know how the business works and the value they provide. And that very much fits into these building blocks because what they want, these are major institutions and they want a secure system. They don't want to just rely on, some random vendor or whatever. They don't want all the transactions to be public. For them, it's very important that if they do issue a bond or trade it, they don't want to leak all that information, and they want to have minimal sort of trust assumptions on that. I think the way a lot of major institutions and companies think about it is that it's like a question of risk. Like, what's the worst case scenario, and who am I trusting, and so on. And if you can remove this kind of arbitrariness and have it be like, okay, this is actually proven that this works, that's amazing for them, right? Because they can create even bigger products that serve sort of their customers. So I think it very much fits. It's just a matter of like the trade-off space looks a little bit different because they are operating in a regulatory environment, so they have to abide by all of that, and they want to integrate with their existing systems, and they also have very high requirements when it comes to throughput and stuff like that. So it's just like a different point in the trade-off space, I would say.
Okay. I'll cover the remaining points that were in the blog post. One is private identities. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why it's important?
So private identities is like, as we move more online and we need to prove certain facts about ourselves, whether that be like our age or our residency or, nationality. There has been even like massive push worldwide to try to gain access to different, websites in the States, in Europe. And although it might come from like the right, intention from many of these regulators, it does possess like a huge risk, right? Whenever you add, as we're talking about, more KYC, like know your customer, like you are leaking your information everywhere, and it's much easier to impersonate. It's much easier to know like, risky details about you online. So this push will be like, how can I make zero knowledge proofs in particular and prove specific facts about me without disclosing all this information, without me having to send the document, a picture or everything, right? Whenever you check into a hotel, whenever you buy, some airplane ticket, whenever you want to apply for a financial product, those are very risky actions that right now we have normalized, but in an ideal state, we don't need to leak all this information. We just leak, yes, I'm over 18. Yes, I'm not from a sanctioned country, or yes, whatever, right? So I will try to differentiate like the projects here, like Greenfield and Brownfield, right? So Greenfield or Brownfield is like they're already digital identity schemes that exist in countries. So for example, in the country of India, the scheme is called Aadhaar, or the program. And there's like 1.3 billion users, having very used to just using their cards and verifying online. And that's not very private. So it's like, how can we retrofit these systems and add zero knowledge proofs and other type of technologies so they can just prove online that they are a specific state or a specific vendor or whatnot without leaking all the rest of the information. So there's like some efforts there. There's a project called Aadhaar. There's projects in the country in Taiwan. There's projects in many different parts of locations. At the end, anything that is signed can be used as a building block, so you can like retrofit and add privacy to it. But then there's also like Greenfield, which what we call is like governments who want to start from scratch or want to improve the current system. And a really great example that is the Kingdom of Bhutan. And there's like a very forward-thinking, kingdom that basically is trying to provide the most secure, most self-sovereign digital identities to their citizens. And they built their digital identity system on top of Ethereum. So they use Ethereum as a way of like trusted registry, where you can know that things signed with this key match to official documents from the Kingdom of Bhutan. But then these identities can be ported over can be carried on your personal phone and can generate proofs and can generate facts about it. Actually, Google also released their own stack a few months ago, earlier this year, and I know Microsoft as well. So there's a trend, right? There's a real need about having strong privacy-preserving digital identity systems, and CK, or zero knowledge, is like a great technology to build things, whether it's retrofitting or building from scratch. And I think Ethereum, or blockchains in general, are also a great thing as a trust registry or as an anchor point for many of these use cases.
And so how does the identity get connected to the person? Because like, what if my like provable identity gets hacked, and then, you know, like a random person who's not me claims to be me, but they have the proof?
Right.
Like, yeah, how can that?
Right. That's a great question. And I would say those are all design decisions and part of like the schemes that you want to do. So two things that are usually used or done in this domain is like, one is like short-lived or single-use proofs, or like, and the other one is revocation. So if you get your passport stolen, you go to the embassy or you go to whatever police station, and the same case with a digital identity, and you, basically file a report. So very similarly, in the future, and even in the current space, you would do the same, and you would have either a list of revocations, like a revocation list. So whenever like the person who steal your identity wants to use it, that check will fail, because now this specific identity will appear as part of the revocation list. And there's just like very clever tricks to how you can check that somebody, you know, has lost their passport, but without leaking all the information from that person. And the other one is like in revocation, there's also expiration dates. So documents also need to have some expiration dates because it's very common, right, that over the span of your year, of your life, you'll have to, you know, renew documents. So I don't think that will change that often, but those are the two techniques. In the short-lived proofs is like, I need to prove that you own like the original document. And there are ways how to like design systems so that I do a liveness check. And I also know that, you know, the person who is presented this proof is actually the same person who is in the identity, who appears. Or that be with zero knowledge machine learning to kind of like make a proof of the photo on your document matches with your face without leaking all this information to the servers and the companies. So there's like a lot of like research and maturity that is going on, but already like concrete use cases that can be used in production now.
And in addition to what Andy said, there's also this thing about, and we see this also with Ethereum and Bitcoin and all this public cryptocurrencies, that you have this key material, right, that you have to keep secure. And I think it started off kind of, it was a bit hard, and you had things like hardware wallets, but now the UX is improving more and more. So for example, you can tie it to your device, so you use kind of Face ID and passkeys and all of these things. And there's more things like multi-sigs, and you can lock it for a certain period of time. And there's things like social key recovery, where you can basically say, if 3 out of my 5 friends or contacts, if they attest that this is me, I can get access. So I think what we're seeing is there's like a massive level up in terms of use experience for how to deal with this key material. Because as we move into more and more digital world and more sort of self-sovereignty, it's very important that you sort of keep this secure, but it needs to be useful by anyone, not just like people who are very deep in technology. And it's in a way better state than just a few years ago. And I think you can see this in various types of wallet efforts and so on.
Okay, so another one listed in the blog post was privacy experience. I don't even know what that means. So can you explain that?
Right. So historically, privacy has been a very difficult topic to use for end user, for normal person, you know, in the street, like just trying to learn how to use these systems, how to keep, you know, your key secure, how to not leak information. And even just using some of many privacy protocols, it's a lot of hassle, right? It's a lot of like understanding the terminologies, understanding the trade-offs. So privacy experience is this effort of trying to understand where are we in the current maturity line, and what are things that we can do to increase the user experience without degrading the privacy and the security that we have in the current systems. So things that like analysis of like the flow of just usability, right? Things like terminologies and language, as what you were saying, like icons that in you know, a few in small images can really depict like key concepts, so to make people aware about the different trade-offs and the actions that they're taking. So as much as like privacy is a technology problem, it's also like a social adoption problem or like opportunity, right? So we need to educate, we need to learn how to relate with these new technologies. So the human aspect is also like very important.
Yeah. I think it's partly like a literacy problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just like maybe you have people from an older generation, just like how to use internet, how to spot like fake news and like all of these kind of things that are like skills that you also need to acquire. And that's very much a part of it. But also, as Andy said, very much about sort of the user experience, like how do you make it easier for people to use? And traditionally, there's been a bit of a disconnect because it's very hard to reason about privacy guarantees. Like that is a fairly technical and a fairly new thing to think about. So you have people who are extremely technical and they talk a language, like maybe hopefully not too much for your listeners with all this name dropping we're doing, but there's like a certain language that how people talk about these things, and that's disconnected from how normal people live their lives. And you're trying to sort of make that connection. Part of that is definitely education. Part of that is like metaphors or like visual indicators. And I guess ultimately having empathy for the end users and making systems that work better for them.
And so now we get to the Institutional Privacy Task Force, which was also listed. And when I saw that, I was like, this one, like just even the word, it sounds different from the other ones. And I realized like in my head, it just sounds like there's probably a whole component that involves like regulation and compliance. So it's like probably quite a different, focus area from the others. So can you explain?
Yeah, sure. It's different, absolutely. I would say the way you can think about regulation and compliance on it's more like a different constraint, right? So you use the same kind of building blocks and same primitives that sort of PC and other people in the ecosystem has been putting in for a long time. And the situation is evolving, right? Like I think a few years ago, it was really the Wild West and there was no regulation whatsoever. And it was really hard for established institutions that are operating in a specific jurisdiction to sort of even start to think about these things. But what we're seeing now is that more and more there are sort of some regulatory clarity and some attempts to make sort of these legislative efforts and regulation fit better with sort of the sort of crypto native side of things. So we're in a much better spot now than we were a few years ago. There's definitely like a lot of work to be done on the policy side and so on. So it's definitely not a work in progress, right? But for example, things like stablecoins and so on, now there's at least some kind of regulatory clarity. And that is just like another type of requirement. And I think you can accommodate both, especially with Ethereum being a sort of credibly neutral base layer. You have both these sort of more extreme cypherpunk hardcore use cases on top, but also these kind of more regulatory and compliance kind of solutions. And they basically coexist. And because the technology is so flexible in terms of synology proofs and so on, you have way more affordances now than you had a few years ago. So you can actually design the systems to accommodate these more complex workflows where, for example, auditors need access and you want to make sure that you meet all the sort of regulatory requirements that institutions operate under.
All right. So the last one listed as an area that you guys were working on as part of this initiative was Kohaku. Yes. Explain what that is.
Right. So Kohaku is this good effort to try to bring privacy to wallets and make it much easier for wallets to adopt. So it's like a reference implementation and an integration about many different privacy protocols that exist currently on the Ethereum ecosystem into an SDK. So like a software developer kit that other developers building wallets or building other type of protocols can just take and very easily integrate it. And I think this is great because it just lowers the cost of adoption for privacy technologies for all these different providers and companies, and just like it's a good way to distribute technology, but at the same time, it's like a good way to set a standards, set a reference, set up like a goal about what would be the perfect, most secure, more private, most like, intention or effort into the wallet privacy. So the intention would not be for the Ethereum Foundation to run, a wallet and try to get end users and try to, get adoption, because that's much rather something that we would like the ecosystem to run and do, business with. But it is a good effort to push into the right direction and implement primitives like the ones that I was mentioning, and even like the rest of the ecosystem have like a point of connection and adding and help push standards. So it makes it easier, a lot easier for builders and to take these technologies, and for users to then more quickly adopt all of these technologies.
Yeah. And I would add to that, like, in this sort of Web 2 world, like developing a product is like difficult and so on, and then you add this kind of blockchain and smart contracts and that component. It's like a specific set of skills, right? And I think the same thing goes for privacy tools. Like it is a very different world, like how you write scenario-proof circuits and so on, and how do you integrate that into a product? It's not trivial. It requires specific expertise. And if you have a wallet and you're trying to sort of serve your users and provide some value, that is kind of scary because it's not always easy to do that. So I think what Kohaku is also doing is showing how you can do it. It's showing examples of it. And I think another thing is that there's all these amazing resources and open source products and so on that exist in the space, but it's not always obvious to people. Like, how do you put them together and like what do they actually provide in terms of a user experience? And what Kohaku is doing is taking all of these primitives that have been developed over the last few years and putting them all together into a package so people can see visually how this is actually fit together. And I think that's very exciting for end users as well as wallet developers, because you can see, oh, this is actually how you combine them. And actually, I think we see some of the things, but in a completely different domain when it comes to institutions, where Ethereum ecosystem is such a broad, it's like a jungle. There's there's so much going on, right? And they don't know how to make sense of it all, and like how do you put these things together? So that's also what we're trying to help with in this mapping effort, and showing here's how you combine all these things, and here's how actually this provides a superior experience to whatever you're considering. So, yeah.
So I want to zoom out a little bit and look at privacy in crypto generally. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of curious, like, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, things like Zcash suddenly just, everybody, it's like all the coins are going down, but Zcash is not going down. Like, we've seen that the last few weeks. And I don't know, traditionally, I think like most people have thought Ethereum is kind of competitive with these other layer ones where, it's like this whole smart contract competition. But do you view something as like Zcash is just fundamentally different because it's like more like Bitcoin, it's more focused on payments? Or do you think that Ethereum is also competing with that? Or do you feel like Ethereum's kind of creating something brand new where it's like bringing privacy to smart contracts and there's like many more applications? Or just like, how do you think about, what you're seeing in terms of other privacy efforts in crypto and where Ethereum fits in with that?
So I guess just briefly on Zcash specifically, I think that Zcash and Ethereum are very much philosophically aligned, and the communities, especially this privacy part of the Ethereum community, and it's like a lot of collaboration in terms of actual code and research and so on. So I think they're sort of seen as like very friendly to each other. And I think the space of like, it's so big that I don't think that it's not competing. They're sort of, if anything, complementary. And Zcash specifically is focusing on payments and so on, whereas Ethereum, first of all, the base layer is still transparent and so on, so a lot of private solutions are more on top. But Ethereum is obviously has a home to DeFi and stable coins and all of these other types of applications. So it's actually somewhat of a different niche. But even to the extent that there are like payment protocols on top of Ethereum, I think they might use similar technology, but I don't think they are like actively competing because the space is so large. That's I guess how I would frame it.
Yeah.
And going back to you mentioned, so I would say also there's definitely been some movements in the markets recently. I would say that when looking at something like Zcash, I think fundamentally that comes from like very strong R&D and making actually real progress just the last year and so on. I believe you had them on the show recently, and I think that's sort of the origin of it, and then everything else happens after.
And I would say like it's well deserved, right? It's like a good team, a good ecosystem, like very value line and just like very strong technically, and they have pioneered zero knowledge proofs, a lot of like languages to write all these things. But yeah, fundamentally just took different paths. So I saw Sean Bowie also like showing like kind of like the philosophy that they were taking, like it's like add privacy, then add usability, and then scale it. So right now they're in the part of scaling, and that is where their new papers, new proposal for upgrades go through. Whereas Ethereum has much more focus on like decentralization and then usability and all these rich history of explorations and new use cases that started on Ethereum, and in the past couple of years have also been focusing on scaling. So I would say like right now we're like super pushing hard on privacy. So I would say like there's a lot of things that we can learn from the Zcash ecosystem. There's a lot of things that now they will want to learn from us as well. How do they scale and how do they bring usability from like the layer 2 centric roadmaps to like other like more core engineering, distributed engineering like skill sets. So yeah, I would say like it's great. And as Oskar was saying, there's like this is a big market, and we're not like against each other, but rather trying to capture the traditional technology Web2 world is how we try to frame it.
Yeah, I would say it's a symbiosis.
Yeah.
Simple. Yeah, win-win. Yeah.
Okay. It was very an Ethereum-like answer, like kumbaya.
Yeah.
Well, so I also, of course, wanted to ask, because Ethereum itself has had many privacy efforts, whether it's like different teams that work like in the Ethereum ecosystem.
Right.
So I wondered what, the EF's new focus on privacy means for these more long-standing privacy apps like Tornado Cash, or even some of these chains. Like, I'm sure you guys heard about the new Ignition chain on Aztec. There's Starknet. Like, there's privacy, it's not like it doesn't already exist in Ethereum. So, what does the new focus in the EF mean for these other efforts?
Right. So I'll start by saying that it's just, a lot of collaboration, a lot of symbiosis. Like, we do have direct lines of communication with all of these teams in the Ethereum ecosystem, because we want to help them and we want to see what they're thinking, what is progress, what direction we're all taking, and just experiment with different primitives. There, I do see, though, which may be a question underneath, is like, if Ethereum layer 1 becomes private, what happens with, privacy focus or layer 2s? And what I always say is like, layer 2s continues to be like key for the Ethereum scaling roadmap and for the Ethereum ecosystem. And layer 2s would always have an advantage in terms of innovation, just because like they're smaller, they're like more, concentrated teams. They kind of like can't just like stop and, start a new, even from scratch, right, architecture, that greenfield advantage that they have. So I love that part. And I love seeing, Aztec, Maiden, Starknet, and many others doing like privacy push, either complete architecture to be privacy focused, or within a generalized architecture, try to add privacy to their stack. So I think that's great in general. And Ethereum also needs that on the layer 1, right? Because there's like institutions and like users, real humans, that we also need to have some levels of privacy. So in general, I would say it's a lot of collaboration. It does mean that kind of like they have a partner that we can like learn more about primitives and libraries and SDKs and programming languages, that we can like accelerate the formal verification, accelerate, the maturity of all these technologies. So just like accelerate the adoption and use cases in Ethereum layer 1 and in layer 2s in general.
And I would say in general, the EF tends to take a more of a subtractive approach. So if the ecosystem is solving a problem, there's no need for us to meddle with it, right? We're trying to work on the things that are overlooked, or we see there's a need for, and maybe there's not enough incentives for other people to work on it, and we can sort of act more as a coordinator and have targeted R&D towards areas that are maybe not like a little bit overlooked and so on. And from an institutional point of view, I do think there's like a lot of appetite for like very customized, like if it's like having a drone L2 or whatnot, and that's kind of also how the Ethereum roadmap is shaping up in terms of allowing these different kind of app L2s or whatnot. Yeah.
If I can give an example, there are like 20-something, 30-something teams building zero-knowledge virtual machines, ZKVMs. And in a way, they all, claim theirs are the best and the fastest or the most scalable. So efforts like just benchmarking these ZKVMs makes a lot of sense. Now, there have been historically a lot of benchmarking for scaling, like how many, transactions they can do per second, how big, the proofs, or how many Ethereum blocks, how fast they can be proven. But now we're also doing benchmarking for how can they run on your phone, like client-side proving. So doing these efforts in tandem with all the R&D and experimentation and innovation that all these teams are bringing really helps accelerate the development of technologies and eventually, the adoption for normal users as well.
Okay, so I want to turn back to the Tornado Cash thing, because obviously, it was huge for Ethereum when everything happened with OFAC, and it was like right before proof of stake, and then you saw like what was happening where the stake was like by I forget, it was like more than half of the transactions were being censored for the OFAC thing. And so I just was wondering, like now obviously it's a few years later, things have changed, but what is your current view on like what you kind of need to keep in mind when you're building these privacy efforts, like from a regulatory perspective? Or I don't know if you've been engaging with different regulators and you kind of already have a sense of like how they're approaching it or what they think about it. But, what from that perspective, what are you kind of keeping in mind as you build?
So going back to, I remember when that whole thing was happening, at the time I was running an R&D lab and we had researchers working on similar types of protocol, and it had definitely had a chilling effect. Like people were afraid of working on certain technology. And I think this is just how, whenever you have a disruptive technology, there's always going to be power struggles and figuring out like how does this work and like is code law and like all of these things. And it takes a while to shake out. And we saw this in the 90s with the first crypto wars, and we saw this with Tornado Cash, and we also, obviously, a lot of things are ongoing, but there's at least been some progress there on the regulatory side. So I think that will kind of always be the case whenever you have some kind of really disruptive technology, which Ethereum and public blockchains are. I would say in general, the way EF thinks about it is that we are more, I guess, on the like R&D side of things. We're not necessarily running things in production. That's not our role. We're trying to facilitate and sort of enable that, but that's usually sort of different products that would take different types of approaches. I would say in general, the ecosystem as a whole has, I guess, learned a little bit from it, and there's been definitely various conversations with regulators that individual teams have had to sort of understand how they can design their systems better. But obviously, people will sort of choose different points here and how adversarial they want to be and so on. And that's just part of Ethereum being this incredibly neutral infrastructure and then people making different choices on top of it.
So just to add to that, there is a spectrum, right? And from one side is like the most compliant, the most like government, the most like, practical or responsible privacy. And on the other side is like the most cypherpunk, the most permissionless. And in a permissionless layer, anybody can build anything at the end of the day. So as Oskar was saying, both will coexist. I guess it's just like recognizing that there will always be these power struggles, these differences of interpretation. What was illegal at the time from the states for a specific government or administration won't be for the next one, and it's not for like different parts of people in the world who also wants to use privacy. So again, like the strategy will be to just continue to be the credible neutral, layer for interoperability and for, teams, governments, corporations, just to be able to transact more freely.
Okay. And one last thing I just want to ask about was, and this is like just from a purely practical perspective, like I know Zcash and I think Monero, they had like the private viewing keys where you could give a party like, the ability to look at your transaction. So is that like a common feature that you guys are thinking about building in, or?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely one design you have. And I think it depends that when we're talking institutions, there are different requirements depending on what regulatory authority you're talking about. So that's definitely one thing that can be chosen. Another thing is sort of if you want to have some kind of audit log. Another is if you need some kind of live access. So I would say it depends a bit on the specific jurisdiction. So I think there's different design choices you can make. And viewing keys, I guess, is one example. And I know Aztec have also different ways of doing this. And that's like one example of maybe a slightly richer affordance than what used to exist. And I guess that's partially in terms of responding to sort of demand from the world. Yeah.
If I were to add more specific examples, like viewing keys might not prevent, someone using a privacy protocol. It will be after the fact. And that is what regulators usually are used to, or auditors, right? But there are things that can prevent before it. For example, an allow or a deny list. Like these addresses, because they have been marked as possible hackers about this specific protocol, are now part of the list, and therefore they cannot use this privacy protocol. And those are like self-regulation mechanisms that the ecosystem has found that I think are very much more appealing to or could be more appealing to regulators and jurisdictions, right? So there are other aspects like, zero knowledge KYCs, like if you have done KYC with a specific institution, how can you take this over and just allow people who have, KYC before? So there are things there. There are things like KYTs or know your transaction, which is like a risk score depending on specific models. So there's just like a very rich design space about when you're thinking about just compliance. It just depends on which jurisdiction you're trying to be compliant with and what are the the needs, the requirements. And there's like it's very expressive technology. There are many ways in which we can build that.
So can you give me a sense of the timeline here? Like when do you think all of these things might be implemented? What do you think will be implemented first? How quickly might we see these things being implemented? Yeah.
Right. So I will say a statement, like a prediction. I'll say like in 6 to 12 months, we're going to say Ethereum has solved the private transactions in the ecosystem. There are just so many teams doing all these trade-offs, and I have no doubt that we have solved these.
And when you say solved, you mean like you have the technological way of doing it, but maybe the implementation hasn't happened, or like how?
No,
how do you
the
define
implementation, the production is already it's only on the adoption phase, right?
Okay,
it's
and
only
this is like for layer one
for
transactions.
layer one transactions.
Okay.
That is my prediction.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm sure like next year we can talk.
We should make a prediction market for it.
Let's do it. Let's start it. Like I'm very convinced that this will happen. It's just like seeing the strength, the technologies, all the different approaches. There's no doubt in my mind in 6 months, 12 months.
And like even like been put into an upgrade and into okay, wow.
Yeah. I know that.
Awesome.
Wallets, so many things.
I would also emphasize that like a lot of things are already in production, right?
Yeah.
So like for example, Railgun, they have I think $4 billion TVL or something like that. It's like private DeFi, so that already exists, right?
Yeah.
And you have similar things like CKID that are used. I think Aztec used it in their sort of recent effort they're doing. So that's already live, and also CKTLS is used for on and off ramps in a permissionless fashion. So there's like all these technologies already live, right? It's just a matter of tweaking and growing the market and so on.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of institutions, like there's already like a lot of institutions building on top of Ethereum. There's, I think, things like private stablecoins is definitely a hot topic, and I think we'll see more and more of that over the next 6 to 12 months. And then it's just a matter of like products phasing it out in terms of pilot products and like slightly larger size and then more deployments. So I think it will be like a gradual shift. But I think there's a very much big appetite for it. And just with the regulatory clarity, I think there's like a lot of parties that are very excited to sort of, be early on it.
Okay, so I need to understand this. Once this all gets implemented, then what is it going to look like? Because, right now we're so used to like going on DeFi Llama and looking at TVL, and we can, look at like an ICO and we can kind of pick out like different addresses, and, there's like those little like bubble maps and like all that.
Yeah.
But like, what do you think there will just be a mix of public and private transactions, or do you think everything will kind of end up going public, or like what does that world look like? Because like for me as a reporter, I'm like, oh shoot, like am I going to be able to look things up that I want to look up, or like so I'd love to hear what your vision is for like what that will look like when it's all finally implemented.
Right. I'll definitely say that they will coexist. Like there will be private and public transactions. There'll be things where we want the public property, right? We want like auditing and traceability and like, I don't know, ensuring like things happen. And it makes sense in that case. If we think like other examples, like in Zcash, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think like 25% or 30 around that is like private transactions. So it's like, it's not going to happen overnight, and there are reasons why you will want to have that flexibility.
Yeah.
But like, I can't understand why anybody would choose a public one. Like once it gets implemented, I'm like, oh, I'll make everything private.
Right. I have an example.
Yeah, I think it would be a gradual shift, right? And like looking at, for example, institutions, a lot of the reason they want to move to Ethereum is in terms of like access to liquidity and the fact that it's like a chain with 10 years of uptime, and so it's kind of they can kind of trust it. It's not going to go away tomorrow. Censorship resistance and being like a credibly sort of neutral settlement layer. And like if you have DeFi ecosystem and you want to have access to that liquidity, there might actually be reasons that certain things are public and so on. And you might mint, for example, a token on L1 as a kind of public thing, and you're going to have access to all this like rich DeFi ecosystem. And certain forces might take longer. So, for example, you can do maybe private payments, but some kind of private trade thing might take longer because it requires like FHC to bring this for its full fruition. So that would be like a stepwise sort of I don't want to say migration path, but stepwise use of like more rich affordances. Yes.
But to give an example, maybe a country does, or a local government does want all their citizens to be able to audit how they spend the money and wanted to make it private. So like anybody in the world can see like this was sent to this transaction and this was the budget that they received and all of that. So there are like real reasons why someone would just want to keep certain things public.
Okay.
Similarly to how we do, in social media, right? Some things we'll just like send over DMs. Some things we'll just make a post for everybody to see.
Right. That's true. Okay. Well, is there anything I didn't ask you guys that you would want to mention?
I think.
Nothing that comes to anything.
Maybe just like final thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So say the privacy ecosystem on Ethereum is very strong. There are like hundreds, like over 200, 300 teams building privacy on the Ethereum ecosystem in all layers of the stack. So it's like a very rich, push that is happening right now, very organic. It's not a reaction. It's been like brewing for years, and there's like a long tradition of it. And because of the programmability, I think we're going to be able to do everything that we can imagine like other blockchains have achieved. It might take longer. It's true that by the current layers are all public, but that does not mean that we can achieve the same levels of properties or use cases that other blockchains have achieved. So I'm very bullish on Ethereum, very bullish on its privacy ecosystem, and it's just right now a matter of like executing. There are still long-term research problems that would just like make things more expressive, more scalable, perhaps different affordances, and there's continues to be like very rich investment in those areas by the whole ecosystem, new companies, and even the Ethereum Foundation. But yeah, there's no doubt that we're executing and that there's already production-grade projects and alternatives that you can use, and that there's just going to be an explosion of even more coming over.
I would, to add and echo that, like I think two things. Like one thing is like, just as, when you have public blockchains that came, and before that, internet and credit card payments, it enables these like rich set of use cases and so on that we couldn't even think about before. And when we talk about Signals proofs or MPC or FHC, all of these types of technologies, you can think of them like programmable cryptography. And it's a similar thing where the people in the space who have been deep in for many years, the way they think about trust and how to build this type of new systems is very different from how someone, for example, a software engineer at Google would think about it. And it just enables completely new types of, new ways of interacting and sort of creating proofs about things and composing technologies. And I think we'll see that will take a long time, not just in terms of technological readiness and so on, but just in terms of mental models and like understanding what this technology allows. And I think that will play out over the next decade, just because the rest of the world needs to catch up. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that on the institutional front, institutions want to move on-chain and they need privacy. So if any of your listeners are representing an institution or maybe a vendor working in this space, I think that's like great to sort of come talk to us because we want to help and we are trying to help institutions move on-chain and making sure the privacy solutions are addressed. So, yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, I could imagine if I were an institution that, like, in my head, it would make sense to use Ethereum because it's like, it's not only the uptime, but it's also like, if one of my competitors is working on a chain, then you know what I mean? It's like, I'm not already directly competitive with Ethereum. So it sort of feels like this is like a neutral ground.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, so I could see it working out well for your efforts.
And liquidity, right? That is also like a very good network effect.
Exactly.
And just mindshare and EVM, standards, programming, tooling,
developers, and just in general infrastructure. So
strong.
I think a lot of people there who understand technology are like, well, we want to use Ethereum, but this privacy thing we're not sure about. So as long as there's ways to address that, I think it's definitely the right choice. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this was super fun. Thank you both so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Unchained is produced by Laura Shin, with help from Matt Pilchard, Juan Aranovich, Margaret Curia, and Pam Majumdar. Thanks for listening.